So yeah, so mortgage applications are up like something in the 20 to 30% range year over year, which is really awesome. And yet we haven't really seen sales move. So that means people are interested in buying, but they're just not feeling comfortable buying. And I'm sure some of you guys have experienced that. But I think this consumer confidence, this is taken by the University of Michigan. There's a ton of different pieces of this, and I've kind of been bringing this in every once in a while over the last few months. But you can see that this chart has been pretty low compared to historical averages for a while. It's interesting because as agents, um, we would think that 2022 would have been a time where consumer confidence would have been high, except what was happening here, prices were going through the roof. So if you're a buyer, you were not excited about the real estate market. You were not excited about buying conditions for houses. And if I could probably sum this up in a nutshell, although I haven't read the back end data, I would say that most consumers still feel like houses and mortgage payments are just way too expensive. And that's what's driving the majority of the negative feelings around buying conditions for houses. But it's also the reason why we have 25% increases in mortgage applications and almost the same sales year over year, right? Because people want to buy, they don't want to have their life on hold, and yet there's a lot of reasons, and I'm sure a lot of chirping in their ears of reasons not to buy. And so I just thought this chart was interesting because I know sometimes I think we feel like we're beating our heads against the wall in the market of the last couple of years because people are excited to do stuff and then they either make unrealistic offers or just don't make offers at all. And I think that's getting even more so as we have more inventory sitting on the market. And so this is one of the things they're not feeling excited about the process. So it's our job to try to help them through that, and I think data can do that. A piece of good news about consumer confidence. So tariffs were April, beginning of April, is that right? Anybody remember? Was it April 2nd or something like that? Was the big day announcement thing. Um, Consumer confidence tanked in April, was pretty low in May, but then it looks like June numbers were up. The number I like to look at if I'm looking at real consumer confidence is this number. So what do they expect their finances to look like in the future? So right now they say their finances are better, but if we're being honest, this is a survey. It's emotional for people. And really what they're thinking about is the trend in the right direction or the wrong direction. Obviously, it's interesting, even during the election last year, which you would have expected things to be lower, things were fine. It started dipping. It looks like November was the peak. It started going down slowly, but then certainly the bottom fell out once we got to the April. All of the tariff headlines were very negative. And then so then that continued. But then June's the first month where there was any kind of sizable increase, and it was actually a pretty big increase on a percentage basis compared to like the movement here has been like somewhere between 3 and 7 or 8 points. And we saw a 13-point swing from May to June. These are preliminary. I'm not sure what preliminary means. Like they haven't massaged the data yet or something. I don't know. If you have enough to put it out there, it seems like it's pretty final to me. But yeah, so all interesting stuff. And from my perspective, that mortgage applications are up, which I don't have a slide for, unfortunately. But consumer confidence and specifically future expectations seem to be moving in the right direction. I mean, all of the numbers are moving in the right direction from May, but it's interesting that they would be jumping as much as they are. So it seems like potentially, barring any more negative news, that the consumer in the United States is feeling better than they were a couple months ago about things. So we'll see if that translates. Obviously, we're coming out of our busiest season, so how that impacts housing probably remains to be seen. But I think if we could get a drop in interest rates in the fall, we could see a little bit of a bump in activity in the real estate market. But obviously, the drop in interest rates is far from guaranteed. So, all right, active listings nationally are up almost 29%, or were up last month 29% compared to last June. So that's pretty darn significant. If we look at the charts, basically this line right here is 2020, and then everything else is all the years since then. So we're definitely the closest we've been to pre-pandemic inventory levels on a national basis. And spoiler alert, we're similar in Columbus. So we've all been clamoring for more inventory. Not sure we're all as excited about it now that it's here as we thought that we would be, but here we are. It usually happens this way in these cycles. Unfortunately, it would be great if we could just slowly trend, but usually it's kind of a gradual and then sudden feeling. And I think that's kind of what we're feeling in the market right now. Total listing count, again, a similar conversation. I'm pretty sure this number just includes the properties that are both pending and active. And so that's why the number's larger. But if you look at from a trend perspective, pretty much the same. Pendings year over year. So pendings, according to Realtor.com at least, are down. So you can see, other than a small bump last year, really pendings have been down year over year ever since 2022, when the interest rates went up. So we've kind of been slowly, again, this is on a national basis, but we've definitely seen things continue to kind of slowly slow down after having a really big slowdown in 2023. Days on market, we're kind of right in the thick of things. Obviously, other than 2020, which was kind of an anomaly because there was that little like whole world shutdown thing that happened during this period. So that's a little bit of an anomaly. But outside of that, we're kind of in line with pre-pandemic. But as you can see, from a percentage basis, like it's not a huge change. 5 days year over year. In my opinion, not significant. We're more interested in the trend, and I think overall the trend is relatively in line with the past. I think the only thing that I kind of noticed in all the data this month, typically May or June is kind of the peak of the selling season, and things tend to start going down from there. And this year, it looks like in the national and the local data that it was May this year. So, barring something crazy happening at the end of the summer, I think we've kind of hit our peak of listing activity. Now, again, the buyer activity could fluctuate a little bit based on interest rates, but at this point, it looks like May was kind of the peak of all things. And you can kind of see that here in the median list price. So it appears that we hit May and kind of plateaued. If you look at most years, the plateau or the peak in pricing and then the subsequent plateau tends to be either in May. Well, it was in May pre-pandemic, but then post-pandemic, it happened in June. So it happened in June all these other years, except for last year. It was kind of the same idea. So again, not a huge difference, like nothing to write home about, nothing to get excited about, but just something to keep in mind. We're basically exactly the same in terms of median list price as we were last year. I mean, 0.2% is pretty negligible. So price reduced share, this I feel like has been up year over year for the past several years. I don't feel like, I mean, it's something that definitely shows that sellers have been unrealistic at times about their list price, but I like to look at the trend line. So this trend line right here in 2022 was when interest rates were going up. That's showing a sharp rise in sellers that were doing price reductions compared to all the other years. We're not seeing that sharp rise this year. So we started out higher and we've kind of like slowly been drifting higher as the year goes on. But again, that happens every single year. Is the year starts off with the lowest number of price reductions, and that because a lot of times people that were going to reduce their price may have taken their house off the market in December. So that's why you see this sharp decrease in December. They put it back on in January. They don't immediately reduce the price because it shows as a new listing, right? And so this is a pretty typical trend. Regional comparisons. I think I complain about this every month for the last 4 or 5 months, but the fun stuff from pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic, they quit posting. So this is really just showing year over year pricing. Midwest is down a little bit, West is down a little bit, South is even, which they had actually been kind of the leader in the negative category. So that's interesting. It looks like maybe they're leveling out, kind of getting through some of that extra inventory they had. And then the Northeast is still chugging along as the best region in the country so far. Nobody is exciting one way or the other, in my opinion. I mean, a 0.9% decrease in pricing is pretty negligible. That's something that could quickly reverse course. And honestly, we're better than that. We're actually positive here in Central Ohio as another spoiler alert. So, all right, as we jump into Central Ohio, so looking at June year over year, we were at 7.7% above last year in new listings. But like I said, again, spoiler alert, the May numbers were better. So we'll look at that in a second, but you can see this blue line right here. It started going down. If we look at last year, we did have a little bit of a rebound last year in July, but pretty much just flat and then kind of the typical seasonal dip. I know I talk about this every month, but I'll repeat it for those of you that haven't been here, and I think that it's always a good reminder to remember. And that is that the buyers basically, I like to look at the pendings line as kind of a representation of how many buyers are in the market. We basically hit that peak in May or June every year. So now that it's July, it would be very rare that we're going to get a huge influx of buyers. Now, we could see an increase in year over year activity, like if rates go down or something like that, but it's extremely rare that we would see a bump in August or September that would make there be more pendings in August or September than there was in May. So when you're talking to sellers, and here's like something we talked about, that one thing that you can kind of put in your cap. When you're talking to a seller, you should be letting them know that, hey, other than, week by week variations, which can happen as a result of a holiday in terms of buyer activity or betting on interest rates, the sooner that you can get your house on the market, the more buyers it's going to get exposed to. So every single week that you wait from now until January, you're most likely to see a decrease on a month by month basis in buyer activity. Now, this varies a little bit depending on the area. So jump into trend graphics if you're with consultants or whatever data source that you're using, and pull up the price range and the zip code or the school district that your listing is in to make sure the data aligns with that. But in general, the activity in the market is going to continue to increase until we get to next year. But it really won't be back at this level of activity until probably April or May next year. Does that all make sense? Clear as mud or understood? Anybody have questions on that? Because honestly, I would say that if you walk away with nothing else from this conversation, that is the most important thing to understand. Everybody good? Cool. All right, so here's just a quick jump into the different suburbs to kind of reinforce that point. However, I will say, like, look, here's Dublin. This is a perfect example. So Trend line is still going down, but last year they did have a bump in new listings in August, which created a bump in pendings in September. And then like the bottom fell out of the market obviously after that. So you can see how different areas may have had a bump. Last September and October, we did have a pretty significant drop in interest rates. So maybe that was something that impacted it. Or maybe just more people listed in August, which is weird because school starts and you would think Dublin would be pretty impacted by that. But you, like I said, you have some weird things happen, but in general, you're going to see that normal trend. New listings in Dublin, just like the overall market, were down in June compared to May. Um, Pendings were up a little bit, but like I said, May might have been the peak for summer. Definitely once we get July numbers, we'll know for sure, but it would be rare, but not impossible that July could be a peak in new listings, but probably pretty unlikely. Again, Hilliard, same thing. So we saw in Hilliard, you didn't really see that same bump that you saw in Dublin in August. You saw a tiny bump in September, but again, the kind of floor falls out at that point. Um, and then same thing here in Olentangy as well. But I do want to just again reiterate the fact that we are definitely in a softer market this year. So if you look at May last year and then also June, so this is in Olentangy. Let's go back and look at Hilliard. It was even more pronounced. So whenever you have a higher dark green bar, numbers sold in a month than are active, that means you have less than 1 month of inventory. And you can see this year we have more actives than we do sold. Same thing in Dublin, same thing in Olentangy. So we could, going into the slower time of the year, we definitely could see a really, quite a bit of inventory sitting on the market. And it's pretty normal that this light green line continues increasing through sometime in September or October before it starts dropping down due to a lack of new listings. So call all your buyers that have been sitting on the sidelines waiting for a deal because this fall could be a good one, especially if you see rates drop a little bit. And really, honestly, rates are really the best they've been all year right now. They're not as good as they were in September and October last year, but rates are in a pretty good spot compared to the last couple years on an average basis. And so definitely some opportunities out there. And OFA made a big change. I don't have a slide on that, but OFA dropped their rates a ton. Um, they made some pretty big changes. The rates turn out to be one of the better parts. I think there's some not so good parts that they made changes on. But long story short, because sellers are sitting on the market longer, they're more willing to accept OFA, and OFA came out with way lower rates. So if you have buyers that qualify that make like I think it's under 110,000 household income, definitely check it out. You're not buying, unfortunately, in Olentangy, Dublin, or Hilliard making under $100,000 a year, but there are houses out there that you can buy for the most part. I don't still want to say none. Um, all right, and then this is just resale versus new construction. Nothing super exciting here. Probably a year ago I started making this graph, but there's so little new construction compared to resale in the overall market. There's just not a lot of impact on these numbers. Um, but if we do look at July year to or month to date, this is interesting. We're down on new listings. So kind of going along with my hypothesis before, most likely we've seen the peak of new listings. And then solds month to date are down 15%, but that's taken with a grain of salt. You really have to wait till the last day of the month to look at those numbers, really all these numbers. But it kind of gives us an idea that we're probably right on trend with last July, which again is going to put us as May being that peak. So these are the resale only numbers. All right, local market for days on market. This is resale only. We've been pretty flat on sales price compared to original list price. Being at 99% is pretty good. Last May we were at 100, and then in June we dropped to 99. This year we were at 99 both months. So again, a little bit of softness in the overall pricing. Um, but otherwise, pretty good. Days on market were up 4 compared to last June, so definitely um, not great year over year. However, you can look May to June, we were flat last year. This year we were dropping. So again, it's kind of weird because there's so much more inventory on the market, but the days on market really haven't gotten out of control here. Um, Months of supply, again, I think kind of in line with where we've been over the last 12 or so months. You can see things definitely picked up last late summer, early fall, and we've kind of been stuck in that range ever since outside of like that April timeframe. Looking at it on a 5 year basis, we're still at one of the highest levels we've been at. So if it feels that way, that's because it is. But at the end of the day, from a historical perspective, remember that months of inventory were still need to get up into that 4 to 6 months before we get to what the market considers a balanced market, and kind of over that 6 month period before we get to what would be considered a true buyer's market. Um, but if you're willing to search hard enough to find a desperate seller or happen to stumble upon one, it could feel like a buyer's market right now, depending on the situation. So, as always, extremely important to communicate with the co-op agent to make sure that you kind of understand what's happening. New construction, I feel like these numbers are boring all the time. Like they kind of, first of all, they don't put nearly all of their inventory on the MLS. Second of all, they kind of just like plop around here. Uh, and so I don't think there's a ton to gain from this. This is one that's kind of interesting. I think we've talked about it kind of fluctuating a little bit in some months. Um, but for the most part, the gap between the list price and sales price has kind of leveled out a little bit. I think last month was the month that we saw it jump up, and we're like, hey, is this going to be a trend? Hasn't really turned out to be a trend. So these numbers here represent the gap between the average list price and the average sales price. You can see that at the beginning of last year, it was really big. And I felt like that was largely due to just, I think, some big land listings that were put on a lot around the Intel plant, but then also just maybe some unrealistic sellers still left in the market. But I feel like we've gone into kind of a normal gap here that looks to be pretty consistent. The other cool thing on this chart is definitely year over year pricing. So even though the active prices have been, were actually down from June of last year in terms of the average list price, the average sold price was still up by 4.5. You always have to take average with a grain of salt, right? Because you could have a few big properties, which there are definitely some expensive houses selling in Central Ohio compared to historical norms, which could be impacting the sales price somewhat. But in general, especially this time of year, we have such a large number selling that I think the average is a pretty fair estimate of kind of the trend in the market. So even though we've seen inventories up 40%, we're still seeing prices go up. So again, if you're talking to a buyer that's been sitting on the sidelines and they're like all excited because we have more inventory, so that means prices are going down. Unfortunately, they're not. You may be able to get a request to remedy. You may be able to negotiate to not have to do an appraisal gap, depending on the area and price point. But to expect a really awesome deal, Probably not going to happen for most people. So I would say new construction right now, to be honest, even though those numbers don't show it, if you have any buyers that are looking for a deal, they could feel like they're getting a deal by getting a lower interest rate, but the builders, especially on inventory homes, are definitely willing to chat on stuff that can close in the next few months before the beginning of the year. I think Pulte's through January, they're offering like a 4.75 or 5%. And yeah, all of them are offering pretty good interest rates. So something to keep in mind. All right, showings. This is all data pulled from showing time, so it's basically just the total number of showings across the market week by week. So you can see we had our normal 4th of July dip. We're the blue line here. So I think I'm gonna have to turn some of these gray or something because it's getting a little messy. Um, but yeah, the total number of showings pretty much in line with historical norms. It looks like last week we might have had, like the tie of the century with the last 3 years here on showings, or the 3 out of the last 4. But yeah, overall, the total number of showings has been pretty much in line with years past. However, because we have 40% more inventory, when you divide those by the number of listings in the market, we're definitely down. Um, however, the gap between this year and last year is definitely shrinking. Um, and the part of the reason for that is that we've been growing in inventory for the last year. So the earlier last year, we didn't have quite as much inventory. And so even if you have the same number of buyers, you have a higher showings per listing. However, if your listing's neighbor just sold last year and had 20 showings, just make sure they understand they may not get 20 showings like their neighbor did last year. They may only get two, actually. So just make sure you're looking at showing time and looking at what the most recent listings had on their first week on market and setting proper expectations. If you don't know how to do that, send me an email and I can send you a Loom video on how to figure out 95% of the time how many showings an individual listing had on showing time. It's my big secret that I don't like to share, but since you guys come listen to me yap, as my kids would call it, I'll share it with you. But you have to agree to keep it in close company because if everybody uses it, it's going to become of no value. Not no value, but less value. All right, and then last but not least, rents. If you own a rental property or you manage someone else's rental property, rents are not exciting. Definitely the COVID crazy chaos is over. That being said, if you've had a tenant in a property for 5 years and not raised their rent, you can definitely raise their rent. However, if you've been raising rent with the market, you're probably not raising rent much this year because we really have been pretty flat, probably for the last 2 years, realistically. But most people have tenants that have been sitting in there way under market, so you can still usually raise rent some. But if you just rented a place out last year, you're probably not getting, either you're getting just what you got last year, maybe even a little bit less. And that's been my experience on the ground too, that rents have definitely softened a bit. All right, that's all I've got. I've got my little sources thing here, which is the same as most months. I didn't add University of Michigan, but I gave them credit, so I probably failed this for those of you that are professors on citing my sources, but I did at least give them credit on the slide. All right, there's a couple of things in the chat. I don't know if they're exciting or you guys making fun of me or what. Of course, Jeff. Um, Yes, Tracy, we can. I'm not sure. I know all of the recordings go on YouTube pretty quickly as well. I missed recording the first few minutes, which I think you may have accidentally missed. So I apologize in advance for that, but you didn't miss too much. Anybody have questions, comments, any personal experiences? My normal people that I pick on aren't on today, so. Do you guys want me to pick on somebody else or just stop talking and send you the recording? Anybody have questions or anecdotal experiences that you want to share? How's the market treating everybody? Good, huh? All right. Well, I'm not going to pick on anybody because I don't feel, I know some of you really well, but I won't pick on you today. So I'm going to go ahead and jump off. The only other thing that I will tell you, Troy at marshhomegroup.com, if you want a copy of the slides, I'm happy to send those to you. If you want a copy of the recording, pay attention to the YouTube or the One Team YouTube channel, or if you don't want to do that, just include in your email that you want the recording, and as soon as it gets posted, I can send that link to you also. So you guys have a great day, and I will see you next month.
Thank you, Troy.
Yep.